As Henry said, my name is Sandra, and I'll be talking to you about the HIV disclosure model. I guess what's so special, I think, about this model is really that it began a conversation about how to support people in the disclosure process. Generally, when we talk about HIV disclosure, it's the criminalization of non-disclosure. And when we're focusing on just the criminalization of non-disclosure, all the responsibility of disclosure is placed on the individual, and we forget about all the systemic, social, and structural things that may influence someone's desire to disclose. So that's really what's unique about the HIV disclosure model, that when it started, which actually started in 2008, it's shifted the conversation. So this project has been going on for about 8 years now. And can I actually just ask you to switch the slides? I'm not going to speak too much about this, as I want to focus on the lessons learned, but about 8 years of research is kind of condensed into that one slide. It's been divided into 3 major phases. So the first was development, which was really community-based research involving women who had disclosure status and women who had not disclosure status to figure out facilitators and barriers to disclosure. We also did focus groups with service providers that worked with African and Caribbean Black women. And at that phase, we created the model. And then in the second phase, it was pilot testing. We had to see if it was effective. And if you look at kind of the bullet points, it gives you a bit more detail about the pilot testing itself. But the feedback that we got from the HIV disclosure support model was that it was very effective, meaningful, and it really did support women through their disclosure process. And the nice thing that came out of this phase as well is that although everyone's disclosure process looked different, the model itself provided a fluid template where someone could kind of join in at any point and then continue on based on their own individual self. So the model itself is very person-centered. And then the third phase is expansion and rollout, where is the stage where we find ourselves right now. And we did more focus groups to see if the HIV disclosure model, which was originally made for ACB women, would work for other racialized populations. So we did focus groups with heterosexual Black men, youth, and MSM and gay men. And what we found was that the model was adaptable to other populations. And Sarah, could you switch to the next slide? So the model itself, for those of you who haven't seen it, looks like this. It's 6 steps: acceptance and empowerment, education and preparation to disclose, establishing motivation for disclosure, evaluating the disclosure environment, assessing potential outcomes, and the disclosure plan and event itself. It's a circular model, but really anyone can enter at any point and go back and forth from whatever step. And I think that's the really nice part about the model, is that, as I said, it allowed for some fluidity, for collaboration and a person-centered holistic approach. If you read some of the points underneath, it takes into consideration community, faith, cultural support. It doesn't just look at the individual. Next slide, please. We can skip that one. So lessons learned. There was 3 takeaway messages. So the first was the importance of partners. I'm lucky that a lot of our partners are here right now. But really, this project has been able to go on for 8 years because of the involvement of all of our partners who were meaningfully engaged. So they helped us with recruitment. They helped us conduct focus groups. They helped us with kind of the support and the ongoing interest and desire to want to train their staff and have their peers participate and know more about the model. So that's one thing that really helped us in terms of this community-based, evidence-informed program that was developed. The second lesson that we learned, if we switch the slide, please, is there were some challenges, and I think that is to be expected sometimes. So something that came up a lot was, although we had a lot of organizational buy-in and a lot of people interested in learning about the model, something that came up sometimes was, how do we get organizations to take on a new program and integrate it into the work they do if we're not providing them additional resources, right? In an ideal world, there'd be all this money to do all the work we want to do, but it doesn't work that way. So we had to find ways where we could make the model a part of the work that the organizations did without adding any sort of burden. And another thing that came up too was, no, go back, please, was there is some difficulty incorporating PHAs as peer support. So one of the huge things that I didn't mention about the model, something that came up time and time again, was the need for peer support workers and the need to have someone, a peer, support others through their HIV disclosure process. And at the end of the day, different organizations work with PHAs in different capacities. So it was finding ways to include peer support through the HIV disclosure process. And some of our partners that aren't in Toronto, for example, are in smaller rural areas. It was difficult because stigma exists still and is still an issue. And that's something that came up as well. So that was something that needed to be thought about. And something that came up too is each organization has its own structure. So if we've created an evidence-based program, how does an organization that per se looks different structurally than Women's Health and Women's Hands, how do they then take it and implement it in a way that makes sense to them? So yes, so then we kind of came up with strategies to bridge the gap between the evidence that we had and service delivery. So we, based on what I said, it was necessary to create a plan to think about how to create a plan so organizations had a clear idea of how to implement it in a way that made sense to them, their staff, their structure. And we were lucky that we got additional funding to take a look at that and kind of have the tools and resources to find more evidence and to figuring this out. If we can go to the next slide. So again, this idea didn't really come from Women's Health and Women's Hands. It's the nice part about doing community-based research is that it generally comes from the community, right? So the idea of creating guidelines for organizations to integrate this model came from a think tank that happened in 2010. And through the additional funding that we got, we were able to do consultations with organizations. We were able to do focus groups with management support workers, peer support workers, and ACB women living with HIV. And through all of these consultations, we were able to figure out somewhat of a template again for organizations to think about how they can implement the program or introduce the program for a way that made sense for their organization. And I think I'm up for time, more or less. I still have time? Okay. So once we developed the integration guidelines, we came out with a toolkit. So kind of where we stand right now is in February, we did a 2.5-day workshop with 40 service providers and 20 peers from across the province. And we have a completed toolkit for organizations interested in implementing this model. And really, again, it's a template. So it kind of breaks things down. So in terms of, it's really question-based. So an organization can pick up the toolkit and then it helps them figure out, okay, who would do what? Do we have the space? What additional resources would we need? Do we need additional training? How can we fit this into our existing programming? So that's where we are right now. I think I rushed through everything because I wasn't I wasn't following the time. But that was really it. And I guess the take-home message about the HIV disclosure for me has been the power of community, the power of partnerships to shift the dialogue about disclosure. Because I think sometimes when we talk about HIV disclosure, we forget about the challenges it is to disclose. Mainstream discussions about disclosure, for some reason, have this idea that it should be very easy and simple and straightforward. And that's not the case. And it's especially not the case for people who have or who are facing different forms of oppression or find themselves worried about their immigration status or what their partners would think. So that's really, I guess, the takeaway message. So thank you.